Hi everyone, I'm Miss Karen at Adams Memorial Library. Thank you very much for joining me for another book report. This week I wanted to talk about books of poetry with you. We have a lot of books of poetry and about poems and how to write them, and books that take place in verse at the library. So if you like them, you can come in and check one out. And if you think you don't like poetry, we have a lot of books that maybe you'll find one that'll make you change your mind. But I just wanted to talk with you this week about a few books, either connected to poetry, about writing poems, or just poems to listen to that I really like. So I hope maybe you will like them too. And this week's books are Daniel Finds a Poem, which was written and illustrated by Micha Archer. Of a Poem in Your Pocket, which was written by Margaret McNamara, and the illustrations are by G. Brian Karras. A Visit to William Blake's Inn, Poems for Innocent and Experienced Travelers. This is written by Nancy Willard, and the illustrations were by Martin and Alice Provensen. One Leaf Rides the Wind. This is written by Celeste, Davidson, Mannis, and the illustrations are by Susan Kathleen Hartung. And these two are the first book and the sequel. This one's called Mirror, Mirror, and this one is called Follow, Follow. And these are both full of REVERSO verses, which were written by Marilyn Singer, and both books were illustrated by Josée Masse. And finally, this big book is full of poems, and it's called Forget-Me-Nots, Poems to Learn by Heart. The poems were selected, and a few of them were written by the poet Marianne Hoberman, and the pictures in this book were by Michael Emberley. So let me tell you a little more about these things. In this first one, Daniel Finds a Poem. This is Daniel, and he really likes to go into the park. He lives in the city, so he can walk to the park. And he loves going there and looking at things and listening and smelling in the park. But one day he sees a sign that he's never seen before. There's not usually a sign there. And it says, Poetry in the Park will be Sunday at 6 p.m. And he thinks, and he says, what is poetry? And he's very surprised when a spider in her web says, to me, poetry is seeing the morning dew shining on my web. So poetry could be something to look at, something pretty to look at. So then Daniel starts asking other friends he sees in the park. So he says to the squirrel, do you know what poetry is? And the squirrel says, it's the crunch of leaves underfoot. So maybe it could be something, the way you listen to something, or the way something feels under your feet, like the crunching leaves. He asked the chipmunk, what does poetry mean to you? And the chipmunk thinks, well, poetry is a home with many windows and an old rock wall. So maybe it's a way of looking at something differently. So Daniel just keeps asking people and animals, asking what poetry means. And at the end, he thinks, what does poetry mean to me? And then he comes up with a poem of his own. So if you're interested in looking at things like a poet would, you might like this story. I really like the pictures I like the words, and I really like the pictures in this one too. And that's part of why I like books of poetry, I think, because often they have really beautiful pictures in. Now, this one, A Poem in Your Pocket, is about the class that's taught by Mr. Tiffin. And Mr. Tiffin tells the class that they're going to have a real live poet come to visit them in their classroom, because in April, they're doing a lot of things about poetry, including Put a Poem in Your Pocket Day. And what Mr. Tiffin wants everybody to do is write their own poem and then write it down and then put it in your pocket, because, you never know when you might need a poem. So Eleanor is very excited about this assignment. Eleanor loves school. She's good at school. She likes writing, but as the days go on, she's having trouble. She's having trouble getting started. Like Daniel, she's just not quite sure what poetry is and what it means to her. So the rest of the class is learning about different forms of poetry. There's a lot of different ways you can write a poem. You could write a concrete poem where the poem looks like it's shaped like something. You could write a funny poem. You could write a serious poem. But Eleanor is just having trouble just even getting started. So if you've ever felt like that, you're just not sure how to get started on something, or if you think you'd like to maybe write a poem or maybe talk to a poet, Eleanor's a little bit nervous to do that because she thinks, oh, what if she has to tell the poet that she's not sure how to write a poem? Well, if you feel like that, you might like reading this book and finding out what Eleanor does and what the poet says about poetry. So this one is called A Poem in Your Pocket. Now this book, this is an older book. This was published, I believe, in 1981, but it's based on a poet who is way older than that. This was inspired by William Blake, who was a real poet who lived, he was born about 265 years ago, so a long time ago. Nancy Willard is a poet who lived more recently, and she really liked William Blake, and so she was inspired by William Blake's poetry to write the poems in this book. And she's imagining, what if William Blake had an inn? Kind of a hotel, place where people could come and stay, and perhaps this young man would like to come and stay there. But this inn it's kind of strange. It's a little bit odd. We were doing nonsense books a few weeks ago, and a lot of the stuff in this story is a little silly. In this book, rather, it's a little silly. It's a little odd because some of the poems that William Blake wrote were a little bit odd. So this poem, for example, is called A Rabbit Reveals My Room. So first of all, the fact that there's a rabbit working at the inn, that's a little odd. But when the young man gets to his room, doesn't see a bed. He sees a bear. And the poem says, when the rabbit showed me my room, I looked all around for the bed. I saw nothing there but a shaggy old bear who offered to pillow my head. I don't know. I don't think I would want to sleep on a bear. I was hoping for blankets, I whispered. At home, I've an Afghan and sheet. The bear says, you will find my fur soft as the hay in your loft, and my paws make an admirable seat. So, if you go to visit William Blake's inn, you might see all kinds of things. So if you like poems are a little funny and pictures with a lot of things to look at and look for, then you might enjoy to visit William Blake's inn yourself. Now, this book, it's got poems, but it also is a counting book, and it also talks about and teaches about Japanese gardens. So everything I know about Japanese gardens, which is not that much, but it all came from this book. And when I visit the Japanese garden at Phipps Conservatory, for example, I always think of these poems in this book. And the poems in this book are all a form of poetry called haiku. And it came from Japan, these haiku poems, the way of writing them. And in this book, each of the poems has 3 lines, and the first line has 5 syllables. So the words make up 5 beats, they call them sometimes. So the first one has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables again. And it's counting, and it's talking about the garden. There's a lot going on in this little book. So this girl's her first haiku says, one leaf rides the wind. Quick as I am, it's quicker, just beyond my grasp. She can't quite catch it. But then 2, She sees 2 carved temple dogs snarling over my shoulder. Sit, guard the garden. And there's a little note here that said, originally there were actual dogs who guarded the gardens, and now a lot of Japanese gardens might have statues of guard dogs to watch over the garden instead. So in this one, maybe you would be inspired to visit a garden or to write your own haiku, like the girl who's visiting the garden here does. So maybe you would like to try this story. If you like fairy tales, you might like these ones. Mirror, Mirror was the first one, and then Follow, Follow came out a little bit later. And I actually think I might like Follow, Follow maybe a little bit more. I like them both very much. I like the pictures. I like the words, but the funny, odd thing, the funny, different thing, I should say, about this book is the poems are all called reversos. And Marilyn Singer, the poet who did the words for both of these, made this form up. I told you haiku was a form, concrete poetry is a different way of writing it. A sonnet could be a way of writing a poem. Hers are reverso poems. And so there's 2 poems on each page for each picture, and they're kind of from the point of view of 2 different characters from a fairy tale. So there could be one from Beauty, one from the Beast, from the Beauty and the Beast tale. And in this one, if you know the story of the tortoise and the hare who had a race, here's the hare, the rabbit, and here's the tortoise. But it's called Ready, Steady, Go. And you can see if you can tell which poem was from which character. This one, the first one says, "That ridiculous loser. I am not a slowpoke, though I may be the smallest bit distracted. I can't be beat. I've got rabbit feet to take me to the finish line." This poem says, "Take me to the finish line. I've got rabbit feet to beat. I can't be the smallest bit distracted. Though I may be a slowpoke, I am not that ridiculous loser." So could you tell which one was from which? This first one was from the hare, and the second one was from the tortoise. But if some of the things sounded familiar to you, you are right, because the poems are the same lines, but in reverse order. That's why it's called a reverso. So in this poem, that ridiculous loser is the first line, and in this one, it's the last line. So the second line is the next to last line, and so on. It's the same lines, and they're just flipped. And that's how Marilyn Singer told 2 different points of view in all of these poems. So this one is a lot of fun. If you know fairy tales, you might like reading this book and seeing if you can guess who was telling which poem. And if you want to write your own, this would be a good way to get started. It's hard. I'll bet it's really hard to do, but a lot of fun also. And if you decided that you would like to either have a poem in your pocket or memorize poems, this is the book for you. My grandmother, when I was little, she told me all kinds of poems, and she had them all memorized. She started when she was really little to memorize poems, and I'm going to be starting late, but I think I would like to do that too. When I was looking through this book, there is one that I actually do remember from the time I was little. It's called Ella Telephony. Let me see, I might have part of it memorized already. Once there was an elephant who tried to use a telephone. No. I mean an elephone who tried to use a telephone. Oh, dear me, I am not certain quite that even now I've got it right. Let me see. I think that was pretty close. So I already have part of it memorized. When I get the second part memorized, then I'll be able to write it down. I'll have a poem in my pocket, or even better, I'll have a poem in my head. So if you decide that you would like to memorize some poems, you could take this book out too. They start out short and they get longer, so you can keep going and exercise your memory muscle and learn a lot of great poems too. So friends, I hope you will come and check out some of these books. And if you have a favorite poem or a favorite book of poetry, I hope you will tell me about it. You can come to the library and tell me, or you can email at kids@adamslib.org. So thank you very much for joining me for Poetry Books, and I will see you next time, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.